All right, I think we'll get started. Oh, you're all so happy. That's excellent. Here comes 2 last house points through the door. Well, welcome to our second Gold Room lecture of the summer. This is great that we've had to have 2. This is a really nice occasion for us, and it's a treat that we have David Green speaking to us on his research. David, you're not going to have a chance to have David in British Studies, but he's one of the voices of British Studies during the regular semester. Voice has become very familiar to all the students over generations here. If you go on to our website and do the U-Visit, the virtual tour, he's also the voice of the virtual tour. David's a senior lecturer in British Studies. In America, that's sort of a associate professor equivalent. And he's a scholar of medieval history here. He's taught other places before Harlaxton, including St. Andrews, Sheffield, and Trinity College in Dublin. I always love to be able to announce fancy-sounding things. So David is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. That's a pretty cool thing. He's a member of the editorial board of 14th Century England, which is a journal. He's on the steering committee of the annual Harlaxton Medieval Symposium. How long have we been doing that symposium?
Nearly 30 years.
Yeah, nearly 30 years in the summer we've been doing a medieval symposium here at Harlaxton. It's a really big deal, and as a medievalist myself, it's very exciting that we get to do those sorts of things. David has published widely, sort of as an academic. He's really a bit of a rock star. Articles on, late medieval Britain, Ireland, France. He's got a book at Yale University Press. You can buy it in the boutique if you like. It's called The 100 Years' War, A People's History. He's written a book on Edward the Black Prince as well, and co-edited a book called The Plantagenet Empire, 1259 to 1453. Tonight's talk is on research, and that he's going to explore further at an international conference in Canterbury in November. And he's actually going to be, are you on the BBC this Friday, or you're just interviewed this Friday? Okay, he's being interviewed this Friday on the BBC, and then next week he's going to be on Graham Norton or something like that. So please help me welcome David Green.
Thank you, Jerry. Can you all hear vaguely? I'm a bit hoarse. Thank you all for coming. And thank you all for coming to hear about someone I imagine most of you don't know anything about at all, who's been dead for a very long time. This is a research project which has sort of stuttered and then continued, and for various reasons has gained life again recently. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Edward the Black Prince died on the 8th of June, 1376. It was a week before his 46th birthday. And with him, the chronicler Thomas Walsingham tells us, the hopes of the English utterly perished. His tomb stands resplendent in the Trinity Chapel of Canterbury Cathedral. You can see the effigy there, and this is the whole sort of arrangement. The effigy lying on top of the tomb, and this is what's called a tester. And these items at the top are what's called his achievements. It's now surrounded by these railings which inhibit a very close view of it. Those weren't there originally. And I want to talk a little bit about this really rather extraordinary effigy and tester, and also an epitaph which surrounds the tomb. They seem in some ways to be rather incongruous. The copper-gilt effigy seemingly glorifies Edward in death by reflecting the military and chivalric reputation he garnered in life. The impression it offers appears entirely conventional, as you can see from that rather extraordinary knightly figure that we've got there. There are some unusual elements, though. This is Canterbury. This is not what's traditionally seen as the Plantagenet mausoleum, the English royal mausoleum at Westminster Abbey. And surrounding the tomb chest on which this knightly effigy rests is an epitaph that derides earthly renown and emphasises the fragility of mundane achievements. And so what I'd like to do this evening is explore some of these apparent incongruities between the location of the tomb, the character of the epitaph, and also think a little bit about some of the materials which were used for the effigy. First, though, who is this bloke, the Black Prince? Edward of Woodstock, known to posterity as the Black Prince, was born in 1330. He was the eldest son of Edward III. He's down here. I've included this magnificently indistinct little blue arrow. Eldest son of Edward III, these are all his brothers, and then Charles V of France over there. He's closely linked, as you may be able to see from this, not only to the English royal family, but to the French royal family as well. As eldest son of Edward III, he inherited very considerable estates in England and Wales, to which would be added very extensive property in southern France. And his life soon became inextricably bound up with the opening phase of the Hundred Years' War, which started in 1337. And the war had many causes, of which control of the Duchy of Gascony in southern France was one, and a contested claim for the French throne was another. There's a change of dynasty that happens along the French royal line, and it leads to the introduction of the Valois line of French kings. And as you can see from this, the Plantagenets and the Valois are essentially cousins. The prince's first military campaign was also the first in which the English enjoyed great success. Edward won his spurs in the victory at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. Further expeditions, though, were curtailed by the ghastly spectre of the Black Death, which ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351. The prince next led a major expedition in 1355. This is the so-called Grand Chevauchée. A chevauchée is a deliberately destructive raid. And it cuts a swathe of destruction across southern France, from Bordeaux on the Atlantic coast to Narbonne on the Mediterranean. This is something akin to total war, medieval style. The prince is said to have destroyed something like 500 towns, villages, castles, and other settlements in the course of this expedition. It's very, very calculated socio-economic warfare. The following year, 1356, saw him ride north into the heartlands of the French monarchy, and King John II had no option but to meet him in battle. The encounter at Poitiers proved to be a much closer run affair than Crécy 10 years earlier, but the outcome was the same and the consequences considerably greater, because the French king himself was captured and taken prisoner. And the terms of King John's release eventually included a major peace treaty in which substantial territorial holdings were handed over to English control and eventually to the Black Prince's governance. Here he proved considerably less successful. His regime in Aquitaine, this area that he came to control, has been characterised as high-handed and thoroughly unsympathetic to the local population. While campaigning in Castile, in Spain, in 1367, the prince fell ill, and on his return to Aquitaine, a rebellion quickly fermented. Within 18 months, nearly all that had been gained in the glory years of Crécy and Poitiers was lost, and the prince returned broken in body, if not in spirit, to England. So his final years were dogged with ill health, almost the last 10 years of his life. And before he made his will on the 7th of June 1376, his protracted decline gave him a good deal of time to ponder his own mortality and give thought to the image that he wanted to leave to posterity. And his final testament included detailed instructions for his funeral and his tomb, including the effigy and epitaph. Now, many of these specifications confirm the typical impression of the prince as a military leader. His tomb and knightly effigy appear entirely appropriate given that military background that I've just talked about. Edward bequeathed his soul to God, the Blessed Trinity, and to the Virgin, and he asked to be buried in Canterbury Cathedral. The funeral cortege he requested was replete with chivalry. The coffin was led through the streets of the town by 2 mounted knights, wearing the prince's armour and helmets. One knight carried a banner blazoned with his arms of war, as they were described. That's the English royal coat of arms, slightly differenced to make out it's the eldest son and not the king himself. And the other knight was to carry his arms of peace, essentially his tournament arms. And these are 3 ostrich feathers on a black field. It's the same ostrich feathers that the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, still uses. And they were to be followed by 4 more pairs of knights bearing banners with the same coats of arms. The procession was to move to the Cathedral, as the will puts it, where the body of the true martyr, my Lord St. Thomas, rests. And this is Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, who'd been martyred in 1170. And there the prince desired to be buried in the crypt, in the midst of the chapel of Our Lady Undercroft. This is a chapel that he'd founded directly before the altar. As for the tomb itself, he also specified what he wanted for that. It was to be of marble and sound masonry, and set about with 12 brass scutcheons, that's shields, 6 of which shall be of our whole arms, and the other 6 of ostrich feathers. So this same alternating of the English royal arms with the ostrich feathers. And there are also his mottos that are included. You can't quite see here, but there are mottos above these. So it's a very personalised heraldic monument. And upon the tomb, he said, we will there be set an image of work in relief of gilt brass in memorial of us, fully armed in plate of war with our quartered arms and half the face exposed, with our leopard helm set beneath the head of the image. And there he is. He sort of gets pretty much what he wanted. This then, it appears to be an emphatically militaristic and political, a chivalric image. And that would be further emphasised with the addition of the prince's achievements, his sword, shield, coat armour and other items. And these are the things which were hung above the tomb. And yet, around the upper edge of the tomb chest, you can just make out the writing, perhaps along here, is an epitaph. And it seems deeply incongruous in this setting. It speaks of the inevitable corruption of all earthly things. And I've just emphasised a few sections of it there. On earth I possessed great wealth, with which I kept high state, lands, houses and great treasures, rich furnishings, horses, silver and gold. But now I am poor and wretched as I lie here in the dust. All my fine appearance is gone, my flesh is quite decayed. I inhabit a meagre and narrow house, the coffin. Again, this is specified precisely in his will. We can assume it offers a direct reflection of his religious attitudes. Originally, the French text would have been much more legible to onlookers than it is now. It seems likely that those encircling iron railings were added around the same time as those that were added to a nearby monument to King Henry IV, probably around 1430. In some respects, of course, this epitaph is rather conventional. It's a variant of what's called the Siste Viator theme. It means stop traveller. It's supposed to arrest people. It's supposed to make them stop and consider, think. It emphasises, of course, the fragility of secular power, earthly beauty, and also really emphasises the brevity of life. It derives from a French translation of a 12th century work. And it's a text which was in wide circulation in later medieval England. But it is very unusual. Most epitaphs of this period only give the name of the deceased, their status, and sometimes what we might call their claims to fame, perhaps as well their dates of birth and death. Now, it may be that the lack of a death date can be explained if there was some sort of placard that was set alongside. There's said to be one of these next to his brother, John of Gaunt's tomb. This was originally in Old St Paul's, the St Paul's Cathedral in London that stood there before the Great Fire. So it may have been a similar sort of setup to that. Or it may be that simply because of the prince's fame and his intention to be buried near the chantry chapels that he founded, rather than the Trinity Chapel, where he finally ends up, he could be sure that his dates would be remembered and recognised. But this is very different, nonetheless, the epitaph from his father's. Equally, the image that we get of Edward III, his father, is very different. And this is only a year later. His father died a year after him in 1377. Edward's tomb is in Westminster Abbey, and as you can see, just the feel of the epitaph, what it's trying to get at, is so very different. It talks about him as the paragon of past kings, the unconquered leopard, referring to the coat of arms again. A powerful Maccabeus, referring to one of the heroes of the Old Testament, who ruled mightily in arms. And it's this difference, as well as the contrast with the prince's militaristic and chivalric funeral, which makes such an expression of contempt with the material world and a condemnation of the flesh seem particularly jarring. That may well have been its purpose. This abrupt juxtaposition of contrasting tones and images reflect a number of trends evident in religious attitudes among the nobility and the gentry in the later medieval period. We're seeing new approaches to worship and new conceptions of piety, and they're driven in part by a constant awareness of war, particularly the 100 Years' War, and of course plague. The impact of the Black Death is very considerable. And these influences are expressed in a sense of both pity and disgust for the human condition, as well as something almost rather puritanical. And we can see it in a number of different artistic media in this period. Writings of the so-called mystics, people like Richard Rolle. It's depicted in various other forms, such as things like the three living and the three dead, and the Danse Macabre. We see changes in wall paintings in this period, both triumphant and terrifying, particularly things depicting the apocalypse. Death and judgment is adorning the walls of churches throughout the country. And they're supplemented by images which are designed to remind audiences about the transience of life and the imminence of death, regardless of eminence. And you also get literary works. This is one of my particular favourites. If people are feeling in a bleak mood, this is ideal for you. This is called The Disputation Between a Body and Worms. And basically it's a corpse having a chat with the worms that are in the midst of devouring it. The fact that you have this sort of material is really indicative of a sort of cult of death that emerges somewhere around 1400. A little bit earlier, maybe as early as the Black Prince's time, but certainly around 1400 and continuing into the 15th century. We get this extraordinary range of images. And it really does give you an impression of what it must have been like to live in an environment in which death is an ever-present feature. Like the tomb epitaph of the Black Prince, the disputation, which concerns a young woman of high social rank, dramatises the stark contrast between temporal beauty and glory and the inexorable corruption of the body. So what we're seeing in these works is a broad preoccupation with human mortality and decay. And they reveal not only fear at the inevitability of divine judgment, but also, and contrastingly, an urge to accept death as natural, as a pale reflection of Christ's suffering, and as a necessary prelude to spiritual bliss. So we're seeing compositions like this designed to encourage humility and demonstrate the vanity of worldly power, but also perhaps to diminish the fear of mortality in a world which seems to be captivated by and surrounded by death. We also see a trend in various circles as well for rather plain, unadorned funerals. This sort of thing is closely associated with the Lollard movement, which was England's first domestically produced heresy. But we can see similar trends elsewhere and among very conventional people. The will of Henry of Grosmont, the first Duke of Lancaster, made in 1361, says that he desired nothing vain or extravagant, such as armed men, covered horses, nor other vain things at his burial. Sir Ralph Hastings clearly felt similarly. When he died in 1397, he asked for his body to be taken to Selby Abbey, where it was to be buried in a simple cart. Now, while the Black Prince's funeral and monument were far from simple, and they were, by Grosmont's definition, very vain, he may well have emphasised with some of these religious attitudes. And comparable opinions, if not exactly the same imagery, can be found in these memorials like this one. It depicts the knight asleep, perhaps, on a bed of stones. The body slightly contorted, as you can see here. These are the stones on which he's sleeping. The legs are, again, they're slightly bunched and hunched. This is Sir Oliver Ingham, former Seneschal of Gascony. It's at Ingham in Norfolk. And there's another nearby tomb which is very similar to this, to a chap called William Kurdiston. And the intention of the imagery in this sort of memorial is uncertain, and it may have been deliberately ambivalent. The effigies may seek to suggest self-mortification, again, this sort of attack on the body. Or it might be a more secular message regarding the difficulties of life in pursuit of a military or chivalrous career. And it put me in mind of a work by this chap, Geoffrey de Charny, who writes a chivalric text around the same sort of date, around 1350. And he talks about good knights who have to undergo hard trials and adventures. He talks about the difficulties, the real physical exertion of being a knight, and compares it with other professions and where are the other orders which could suffer so much. So perhaps that sort of image is emphasising the difficulties of a chivalric lifestyle. The apparent discomfort of Ingham there, and the revulsion with the body evident in the prince's epitaph, are themes later combined and developed in many transy memorials. Have any of you been to Lincoln so far? Did you see the transy, the split level thing? It's to a chap called Richard Fleming. It's around the same sort of date as this one. This in many ways is much grander. This was done to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry Chichely, as you can see here, died in 1443. What I always find extraordinary about this particular transy, and of course we've got the Archbishop there in full episcopal regalia, hands in benediction, symbols of office, really emphasising the social and political office that he held on earth. And then an image of him below in death, as essentially a corpse. And what I always find interesting about this is that Chichely had this monument commissioned during his lifetime, and it's placed in such a location in the cathedral so that he could contemplate his own death image from where he used to sit. Which again, this sort of cult of death is an extraordinary thing in this period. As you can see, this also has a very suggestive epitaph, talking down about now being cut down and served up for worms. So I wonder then, when set against the sort of grand display of knightly vigour, the Black Prince's epitaph should be seen as fairly representative of a religious trend much favoured by a number in the Prince's circle and in the wider English elite. There are, though, other tensions evident in the tomb, its design, and its location. And among these, the Prince's wish to be buried at Canterbury, rather than what's usually considered the Plantagenet mausoleum at Westminster Abbey, seems especially unusual. He's the first member of the English royal family to be buried in Canterbury since 967. There is no trend for this, there is no background for it, so it is peculiar. Following the death of the Black Prince's uncle, John of Eltham, in 1336, Edward III made it clear that he wanted to ensure that Westminster would truly become the royal mausoleum. And at that time, the prince ordered the relevant cathedral authorities, or rather the abbey authorities, to ensure that suitable spaces were available for the burial of senior members of the royal family. And he writes to them that they were to reserve and protect the most honourable positions for the rest of us and our heirs. There needs to be sufficient space for Edward and his family to be buried in the right part of Westminster Abbey. It's clear, though, that Westminster had not necessarily been the obvious choice for a royal burial prior to this. Edward III had himself dabbled with the idea of being buried in Cologne Cathedral. It's where the Magi, the three wise men, are supposed to be buried. And despite the king's wishes, a surprising number of his close family decide to be interred in different locations, or circumstances ensured they were buried elsewhere. Don't worry if you can't see this, it doesn't matter too much. Anyway, these are members of Edward III's close family, and I've included their places of burial. And you can see there are a number that end up in Westminster, some eventually, after a bit of a stop somewhere else first. But there are a good number that don't. And Edward sometimes ignores his expressed wishes himself. Other foundations, such as the Benedictine house at Abingdon, the Church of the Greyfriars in London, and the Dominican Abbey at King's Langley, were regularly chosen instead. What I find interesting about this is that of Edward III's 5 sons who lived to adulthood, only Thomas of Woodstock, down here, is buried in Westminster Abbey. And he was first buried in St Edmund's Chapel alongside his wife, but Edward IV had his body relocated to a more appropriate position. And I'm not quite sure why this is. It suggests in some ways that Edward III's children are sort of competing to create their own memorial spaces. And in some ways this is unusual because Edward III is very, very good at keeping the rest of the family on side. This is not like Henry II, whose family are constantly rebelling against him and all that sort of thing. Edward III sort of keeps everyone within the family business. So it seems peculiar in some ways, but they may be seeking to establish what might be described as their own necropolis. I think that's the plural of necropolis, I'm not sure. So, like the Black Prince, John of Gaunt, I suppose his most famous brother, ends up in St Paul's Cathedral, and he is the only member of the royal family to be buried there. He too commissions a chantry, a separate chapel, for his own sort of commemoration there as well. So they may be doing similar sorts of things. There seems to be an element of competition in death that hasn't necessarily been there in life. The Black Prince's association with Canterbury stretched back many years. He first visited the city with his mother and father when he was only 3 years old, and on that occasion he received a gift of a little alabaster cup worth 6 shillings. However, the cathedral's main attraction for him probably stemmed from its association with Thomas Becket and the cult of the Trinity. Certainly after the victory at Poitiers, Edward felt it worthwhile delaying his return to London to make offerings at Becket's shrine. And a further consideration may be the celebrations associated with the bicentenary of Becket's martyrdom in 1370. Perhaps these thrust the cathedral back into the forefront of the popular consciousness. In other ways, I think this is peculiar, though, the association with the Black Prince and Thomas Becket. It seems peculiar that the Black Prince, a man with such an interest, it seems, in the sort of full expression of royal power, also had a penchant for Thomas Becket, who, of course, is martyred for opposing royal power. It might be the case that Becket by this time has simply become an English martyr, accepted into the sort of pantheon of national saints. Certainly Becket's biographers had linked his martyrdom to the idea of the sort of communal liberties of the English people. These might be linked to ideas about virtuous rulership, perhaps. Don't know. It's worth noting that a number of pilgrim badges from the 14th century, if you go as a pilgrim to Canterbury, you might come back with a badge to show that you'd done it. These also reproduce the coat of arms of St. George, the English national saint, and the shaggy hind legs of a lion rampant, which show the association between the shrine, the nation, and the monarchy. And these lions are all over the prince's achievements. Now, I'm going to come back and talk about these. I went down, I had the opportunity to see some of these things which have been in storage since 1939, last year. And I didn't realise quite what I was going to see, which is why I only took my rather dodgy camera phone with me, which is why some of these pictures aren't brilliant. But even his belt buckle has got little lions on. They are all over this stuff. It's incredibly intricate work. I'm going to come back to it. This is the stuff which has been examined much more recently. These are his gauntlets. Again, the angle isn't brilliant. What you have here, and you can see where the holes are on the knuckles, are more lions standing up out of there. So the degree of attention to detail, the focus on the lion as an English national symbol is very, very striking. Some of these, though, have not, time hasn't been terribly kind to some of them. They were hanging above his tomb from 1376 until 1949, though. So they had a chance, but he used to have a tongue, and he's lost a lot of his mane and that sort of thing. But this is what's called the cap of maintenance. And it was originally very grand and supposed to be rather striking. Now he just looks slightly cuddly and a bit beaten up. Poor old thing. The choice of Canterbury may also have been shaped by the prince's good relations with the cathedral authorities. And he tended to have very cordial relations with the archbishops, although Simon Islip did question the prince's highly controversial marriage to Joan of Kent. I wish I knew more about Joan of Kent. On the basis that the legitimacy of any offspring from their union might be challenged. And that indeed did prove to be the case when their son, Richard II, was deposed in 1399. It was also a difficult marriage to arrange because of the need for a papal dispensation, because Edward and Joan were related within the prohibited degree. And in return for that dispensation, the prince founds 2 chantry chapels at Canterbury. And it was there that the prince asked to be buried. And this is the charter which gave income from 2 of the prince's manors, Vauxhall and another, in order to sustain these chapels. And there you can see his seal, and there is his helmet, and his shield and coat of arms, and the ostrich feathers, and there's the cap of maintenance above it. The prince, though, is not buried where he asked to be in the crypt. He's relocated to the Trinity chapel above. It's not far from Becket's shrine. And there's no clear evidence when this decision was taken. It may have been a last-minute choice, perhaps made by Edward III. Perhaps it was something that took place a little bit later. It may be that the prince did end up in the crypt to start with, and subsequently the tomb was relocated in the Trinity chapel above. In some ways, though, in architectural terms, there are some close similarities between the two. These are a couple of maps which show the route that pilgrims would take if they were visiting Thomas Becket. And there were various places around here that you would visit in order to take in various scenes associated with Becket's life and his martyrdom. This, unfortunately, has slipped rather. We should be slightly higher up. He's in there. That's Becket's shrine. There's another element associated with Becket which is in there, and this is the crypt where Becket's tomb was originally. And pilgrims would process around the crypt first before making their way up onto the main level of the church, work their way past the Black Prince's tomb, past the far east end, and then circle round to see Becket's shrine. So wherever he was, if he was buried down here where he originally intended to be, pilgrims would pass by the prince's tomb in any case. So the decision to relocate him, although it's a much more sort of splendid location, means it was still part of the pilgrim route. The Trinity Chapel, though, and I don't know if people have been to Canterbury, you can still feel the absence of Becket's tomb. You know, there is that space still after 500 years. And it must have been extraordinary. It's arcaded with columns of rose marble and purbeck, and the symbolism of the colours explained in the extraordinary stained glass windows which depict the saint's martyrdom, and dominated by Becket's overwhelmingly opulent shrine. And we don't know precisely what this was like, but we do have various accounts of the shrine. Simon Fitzsimmons, a friar who visited Canterbury in 1322, described it in the following terms. The body is in a case made of most pure gold, and adorned with innumerable precious stones and shining pearls like unto the gate of Jerusalem, and sparkling gems, and even crowned with a regal diadem. I have two conflicting thoughts about this and the impact of this extraordinary shrine, by far the most opulent in England and certainly one of the most opulent in Europe. Perhaps when set alongside Becket's shrine, the Black Prince's tomb looks rather austere, perhaps appropriately humble. Or, by contrast, did the Prince's effigy, that extraordinary copper-gilt, reflect the candlelight and jewels and stained glass to appear even more resplendent? I'm not sure. Let's have a quick look at the tomb and the effigy then. The tomb chest is a splendid example of a London variant of the Perpendicular style. It's constructed in time for his funeral on the 5th of October 1376, and it's very probable that the famous architect Henry Yeverley undertook its construction. It's a very, very fine example. It is, though, the effigy that I find particularly interesting. Given its similarities to the effigy of his father, Edward III, it's been suggested that they were manufactured in the same workshop, perhaps at the same time. The details of the armour are exquisite. They are so precise, and I always really, really like his moustache. Isn't that brilliant? Some commentators have been less than complimentary about the face. Joan Evans famously described it as curiously lifeless, which seems, I'm not sure if she was being deliberately. There are questions, of course, about whether these sorts of effigies are supposed to provide a true likeness, whether they are supposed to be a portrait, if you like. It may well offer a deliberately formulaic rendition of a military prince. Most effigies are fairly standardised, although some monuments to members of the royal family, Philip of Hainaut, Richard II and Henry IV, are clearly exceptional, but few seem to display an individual, a realistic likeness. Those of lesser status tend to be far more explicit about the heraldry that they wanted showing on their tombs than on the form of the effigy. I'm not going to hold on to this very long. It's a vague speculative idea that I have at the moment about where the idea may have come from for the design of the effigy. There were some famous images from St Stephen's Chapel in Westminster, which depict Edward III and his family. These are supposed to have influenced a number of memorial brasses in this period. And it might be that the prince was getting, or some ideas were coming from this for use in his effigy. I'm not sure. I think that's probably rather speculative. A further incongruity lies in the material that was chosen to construct the prince's effigy. This choice of gilded copper appears somewhat unusual at the time. Edward II and John of Eltham, the prince's grandfather and uncle respectively, were commemorated in alabaster, a form of marble, as were Queens Isabella and Philippa. And the effigies of Edward's French royal ancestors were also routinely fashioned from the same material. However, Edward I had chosen copper-gilt for the images of his first wife, Eleanor of Castile, and his father, Henry III. These gilded copper effigies are usually retained for those holding pretty much the highest office. It's kings and queens. So the choice of gilded copper for the Black Prince, who was never a king, is perhaps a little bit unusual. The use of gilded copper and the addition of a tester, which I'll come to in a moment, it's the canopy which is above the tomb, in preference to an elaborate architectural canopy, may also be significant because it suggests a similarity between the Prince's monument and those of reigning monarchs at Westminster. And yet the Prince is portrayed as a fully armed knight, rather than this wise, judicial, sort of Solomonic representation that we have there of Henry III, and of course also have of Edward III. So we've got this sort of strange mixture of the knightly, but also the kingly. Perhaps the effigy suggests both the kingly status the Black Prince came so close to achieving, he would have been king if he'd lived just another year, while also recognising the deeds for which he was most famous, the chivalric and military. Those military aspects of the tomb are further emphasised with the prince's achievements. These are the originals, which were in storage from the outbreak of the Second World War. These are copies that were made after the Second World War, when it was decided that these originals were too fragile to go back there. Now, the use and subsequent display of these items was encouraged or inspired, it seems, by various aristocratic funeral trends. From the mid-13th century, it became increasingly common for members of the nobility and gentry in France, England, the Low Countries, and Germany to have these sort of martial, chivalric accoutrements displayed at their funerals, and they're subsequently given to churches as mortuary offerings. And the prince had requested this in his will, and it's something which is later taken up in English royal funerals. So in 1377, when his father dies, this same process happens for the first time. So the prince's funeral seems to be hugely influential in the way that English royal funerals follow. It's an interesting comparison as well because of what's happening in French royal funerals at the time. In this period, broadly speaking, English and French monarchy is going along sort of similar directions, but there seems to be something of a diversion around this period. It's a divergence, perhaps. French royal funerals in this period are increasingly stressing the sort of sacral, the holy nature of French kingship. In England, there seems to be a shift to the military and chivalric aspects of Plantagenet power. There's another image of the cap of maintenance. He looks a bit better there. You can see the fur. That's good. And this is the shield and the jupon. If you'd been here, I've forgotten when it was. It was the end of last year. These were items which were involved in a major exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It involves some very fine embroidery, and these are the items which are currently under discussion, and they're thinking about how these items might be best redisplayed to the public in the cathedral. One of the ideas that I rather like is that they are going to go back in the crypt where he wanted to be originally, which seems rather appropriate. Now, the final element of the monument was not part of the prince's original design, but its subject was clearly one that he favoured. His effigy is down here, so he's looking up at this image now, which has also, as you can see, suffered rather, but what you're essentially looking at is an image of the Holy Trinity, surrounded by the four evangelists. It might be considered to be the prince's sort of personal vision of heaven. And the prince's devotion to the Trinity was well known, and it seems to have exceeded conventional piety. And that devotion may well have taken a part in the decision to relocate him from the crypt to the Trinity Chapel above. That relocation also allows for this tester, this canopy, to be included. There really isn't that much space in the crypt below for this sort of thing. So it allows for an expansion of that design. A friend suggested to me that if what you've got with an image of the prince, where are we? So he's down here, he's looking up at the tester, and then below him is that epitaph which is talking about mortality, essentially. It's almost as if he's in purgatory. He's somewhere between death and heaven. I like the idea. I've no real evidence for it at all, but I like the idea. So, we have a good deal of evidence that the prince was very keen. He was a devotee of the cult of the Trinity. We've got a good deal of other evidence to show this. We have, for example, this funerary badge, which is now in the British Museum, which shows him encircled by a garter. He was a member of the Order of the Garter, England's foremost chivalric order. And soon after his death, Thomas Brinton, who was then Bishop of Rochester, preached a sermon in which he stated, "And because power without wisdom is like a sword in the hands of a madman, and wisdom without goodness is called calculation, this Lord, the Black Prince, is most praiseworthy because he excelled in power, wisdom, and goodness." I'm not sure any of those are true, but never mind. And it talks about his devotion, as you can see, to the Trinity. To conclude then, the prince's funeral and memorial were not perhaps as incongruous as I first thought, but they do encapsulate a striking and sometimes contrasting blend of trends, impulses, and influences. And this reflects the wide range of religious, political, and cultural purposes the funeral ceremony and the monument had to fulfill. It needed to make a statement about Edward's political and chivalric status, as well as his piety. The memorial was a tribute to a king in waiting, a man sometimes described by contemporaries as Edward IV. And yet it was not located alongside kings in Westminster. It served as a glittering reflection of the chivalric qualities valued in Plantagenet England, for it marked the resting place of one according to Chandos Herald, his biographer, who from the day of his birth thought of nothing but loyalty, noble deeds, valour, and was endowed with prowess. And yet by means of the epitaph, the memorial also bears many of the connotations of the later Transy memorials. While there's no cadaver, the text suggests something very similar. The aristocratic funeral ceremony has been described as perhaps the quintessential later medieval expression of the fundamental and complementary relationship between the sacred and profane. In the same fashion, the prince's tomb comprised an almost dissonant combination of elements: pious austerity and ceremonial grandeur. It evoked a sense of introspection suffused with chivalric ritual, and it reveals a stark awareness of personal mortality, balanced somewhat precariously against a delight in worldly splendour. Thanks very much.